My name is Robert Kershaw, and I'm the author of It Never Snows in September, which I wrote some time ago when I was still serving in the army. I speak and read German. I attended the German Staff College, and I was requested by the British Staff College to see if I could assist them with a battlefield tour that they were doing with British veterans in and around Arnhem. And the question for me was, could I interview some Germans or find some Germans for them to attend and be interviewed? Well, in the event, that was not possible, and I was actually working with the German army, the Bundeswehr at the time, and they agreed to get information together for this particular event. And a whole flood of very personal papers, letters, and accounts came in, which fascinated us all, and that was the stuff that I used on an initial battlefield tour in Arnhem, and much later they persuaded me subsequently to write a book and include all this material. The operation was a huge risk, and I think probably the Allies at the time were justified in taking it. A lot of the comment about Arnhem has been with the benefit of armchair hindsight, and you've really got to try and get back to the times when the German army was visibly collapsing after the debacle in Normandy. They'd retreated in great haste into southern Holland, and it appeared that just one more shove would bring the whole edifice crashing down. The British Airborne formations waiting for action in the UK were itching for a chance to get into the fight, and this particular division hadn't seen action since Italy about a year and a half before, and they felt that the war might indeed be passing them by. They'd been stood up for a large number of operations that actually hadn't happened, so they were very anxious to get in. And with the information that was available, it appeared, despite factual data that there were German units consolidating in around Arnhem, there was a feeling, okay, but they would probably be swept aside in the next major offensive. I'm an ex-parachute regiment officer myself, and we would always want to be dropped both sides of the bridge if there was an assault where you wanted to take it. The film actually portrays the American paratroopers capturing the Nijmegen bridge. That is not entirely true. It was a joint operation. Actually, the British tanks got across the bridge 45 minutes before the American paratroopers arrived at the northern end. And the British tanks actually met the paratroopers in the village of Lynch on the far side. But because it was a joint operation, that is why both those elements succeeded. The tanks wouldn't have got across, and neither would the Americans probably have captured the bridge, but for that happening at the same time. So that was a slightly glossed over bit of myth, really, from the point of view of the filmmakers. Once they had captured the bridge, and this is debatable, they could conceivably have pushed an armoured infantry group up the road to reach Arnhem. I interviewed the German SS General Harmel, who was responsible for the defence of the bridge, and he gave me an artillery map. And artillery maps will always show the location of friendly units. And it's obvious from this particular map and his statements that there was very little on the road between Nijmegen and Arnhem at that time. In fact, there's only a couple of companies of infantry, security pickets, in the village of Else, which is midway between the two. So they may have been able to push an armoured battle group up that road. Harmel thinks so, because he very sarcastically said, and the British stopped for tea. And that's the version also that the Americans would have you believe. I'm an armchair strategist talking in hindsight, and he was the man there at the time. If he says that the psychological impact of a unit pushing down that road could have been decisive, then I think you have to listen. That is quite possible. Harmel was a very clear and precise man. He gave the impression, when he spoke to me, he was smoking a huge cigar, puffing smoke all over me, and he gave me a very clear exposition of his defence of Nijmegen and Arnhem. He was responsible for both bridges because it made sense. One was reinforcing the other. And he told me things that were not in Cornelius Ryan's book, and I pointed this out to him. And he actually said to me, well, I told Cornelius Ryan this stuff, and he interpreted it in a different way. For example, I pointed out that Harmel was in the bunker and able to see the Nijmegen bridge, and he said, well, no, I wasn't in the bunker. I was actually conducting the battle from a Volkswagen Jeep because he was switching between the two locations. He had to fight the Arnhem Bridge free and defend the Nijmegen Bridge. So he was driving up and down the 10 kilometres between the two locations, constantly coordinating the battle. So being a soldier myself, all that had a ring of truth to it. So what he told me I found interesting and probably authentic. From the British perspective, they'd just captured this bridge. Only 6 tanks got across. 2 of them were knocked out on the way, so there were only 4 in the village of Lynch on the other side, and they were reinforced by the remnants, the survivors of that very heroic assault river crossing that the American 82nd Battalion had accomplished. So they were actually very short of troops and tanks, and they would certainly have been anticipating a heavy counterattack coming in, because traditionally that is what had happened thus far in the campaign between Normandy and where they were now. But the Germans didn't have the resources to do this. At the same time, the 4 tanks across the bridge had only tenuous contact with the guards in Nijmegen on the other side. Lord Carrington, who was the second in command of the squadron that made that crossing, was responsible for the radio relay between the two. And the Guards infantry were still very much fighting in Nijmegen. The real opportunity that was lost, I suppose, is possibly the psychological impact of pushing a unit up the road after 7 o'clock, if one had been available. But the real lost opportunity was the fact that the Americans decided not to give the Nijmegen bridge the top priority on the first day, which was when they landed on the 17th of September. They instead put their weight behind the defence of the Groesbeek Heights, which is to the east of Nijmegen.